triple mics or something so I wouldn't have to hold one, so I could be as one with my Italian friends and talk with my hands. Well, it's wonderful to be with you. I love coming to New York and love coming to Long Island. Elisa and I were visiting on the way from the airport last night, and I was telling her that I began coming to New York City and to Long Island in the 1970s when I worked for a large corporation that was based out of New York City. And so I worked up here for about 15 years until American Airlines moved to Texas, and then I went to work for them and was able to stay in Texas all the time. But my second home, really, other than Washington, D.C., has been New York City and Long Island, so I love it here. And I still have many friends who live here, and some of them are here today. So it is really good to be with you. The last time I was here, I was just on the, right at the beginning, or the ending rather, of getting my book, Sacrifice, the Abortion Conspiracy, published. That is now published and available. And as he said to you earlier, I don't have products to sell, but we do have a book to sell. And it's my first book, which is what I call the first segment of what we'll be getting ready to talk about today. But basically, we have solved the conspiracy, for lack of a better term, to take over the world by taking over first creation. Now, when I realized what had been done to us as a people and as a world, and how God's creation was being circumvented by this one particular thing, I was able to go back and look at that earlier research with a new lens and realize that it doesn't just begin and end with abortion, but rather it's because of the ideologies of these people that advance this scheme. It also extends to include transgenderism, the public health issues and so forth that we're facing today. So it's kind of like a trifecta against the human race and against God's plan for creation. And so with that thought in mind, I will get started and I will show you some of the things we've discovered since the last time I was here and since the book was published. And I'm having to do 3 or 4 things at one time here. I'm sort of dyslexic, so it may be a little difficult for me. You know, God's plan for creation was that we were created in his image to procreate and to recreate. And as J.R.R. Tolkien said, God called us and created us to be part of his divine creation. And we are to multiply the earth, yes, through procreation, but we are also called to be co-creators with God. And that means we create things in the culture, you know, whether it's art or movies, books like Tolkien, or whether it is, you know, in the medical field, creating new scientific advances that can save our public, right? So there are all kinds of ways we can co-create with God. But the one thing we cannot duplicate, and that evil powers that be and have been for many centuries want to recreate, is the ability to harness and manage God's creation. And so that's why the title of this next book is called The Creation Conspiracy. It's the story about how the enemy has conspired with evil people, evil operatives on this world from the beginning of days, but most specifically, and since about the 1800s, he's been conspiring to take over our world through this taking over of creation. Okay, this began, the phase 1 of it, of course, was divine creation and God's plan for man's creation, and some people stepped up and did that. But interfering in all this, after the Reformation and all these things, came the Enlightenment. And this was called also the Age of Reason. And this is when people like Charles Darwin emerged, you know, with his new ideology about how creation was forged and founded. And many people from the Enlightenment came forth with very liberal, what I call liberal ideology, that has morphed and reconstructed into the liberalism that we know today. Okay, and unfortunately, when we look back at our democracy and the democracies and monarchies of the Eastern world, or the Western world rather, we find that we were given the choice in these matters, where other countries and other nations then, and even still, war and revolution was the way these countries were taken over. So the goal from the beginning, we were created in the structure of liberty and justice for all, with life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness being the cause for this. And if you think about that, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, those are the areas around which this ideology is woven, in this thing about being able to choose those things and to choose what those look like for yourselves. And in looking at that, we can see how wickedness can come into that situation and say, to choose this particular thing, whether it be abortion or whether it be being transgendered or a particular lifestyle, Satan, I believe, has taken things that should have been sovereign in God and flipped them around and said, no, you should be able to choose to do these things. And abortion was the beginning of it, okay? But this was all founded, but prior to what I call the age of choice, we had the age of political revolutions, right? And so we had Karl Marx, who wrote the theories for all these things on which all these other revolutions were based. And then we had Leninism, Stalinism, Nazism. And by the way, Margaret Sanger was close friends with Adolf Hitler, and they conspired together in this 1927 conference to get the world where it exactly is today. And then this morphed in 1945 into liberalism. And that is the bane of our existence as a human race, even still, and most certainly politically. In 1927, there was a group of people that met in Geneva, Switzerland. They founded the World Health Organization on the backside of this in 1927, and they formed a plan to socially engineer the world. Margaret Sanger was the person who conducted this conference. She wrote the conference proceedings in a book. I discovered the existence of that book in my research for my first book and proceeded to try to find it. Guess what? I couldn't find it. I ended up having to go to England to get the book, and it was finally found in Geneva through a bookseller in England, and I was able to get it. As far as I know, I have the only copy of that book available in the United States, and it has been banned, officially banned. The Library of Congress actually told me that. But you can't buy it. You can't find it in any university. And so the research in my first book is based on what we found in that population conference of 1927. And I need to start saying this about this book. On the cover of this book, Lisa, hold the book up, okay? On the cover of this book, that is the proceedings of the 1927 population conference, population control conference that was held in Geneva, Switzerland. That is the exact cover of the program. It was signed by Margaret Sanger and given to the Library of Congress for their archives. So that is the cover of the book. And everything that we have been experiencing since 1927 as a culture, including the Holocaust, was all planned at this particular symposium that they had. Amazingly enough, 10 days before this symposium, Hitler held the Nuremberg rally. Guess what? The same scientists, doctors, sociologists, and economists and political experts were at both things. The Nuremberg rally first, 10 days later, they went to Geneva for Margaret Sanger's conference. So the same participants were in both. One of these people, since I have a rabbi friend here, hi Rabbi Gotti, one of these participants was a Jewish scientist, a female scientist, and she got all behind the structuring of the earth based on social selection, coming from Marxism. And unfortunately, both of her daughters perished in the Holocaust. And then she died of a natural death during the Holocaust, assuming grief over her daughters. So there were people from all countries, all religions, and of course many, many, many atheists and Marxists at this conference. And they decided at this conference that they had to insert a component into this, and I call it the matter of choice. Now, I want you to think about our political elections we've had these last few decades. What is everything framed around? A matter of choice. It's a right to choose, a matter to choose life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness, to choose, right? And in that matter of choice, we have chosen to turn our backs on God. Okay, when that happened, the modification of God's created order for reproduction, family, gender, and genetics and biology, it required a takeover of science and the media, right? And what have we seen since, say, 1950? We have seen a takeover of science and the family, those two things. And the abolishment of personal freedom and family rights was obtained in our era from 1945 forward. It has been obtained not by guns and not by revolutions, but by communication and selling the country and the world on the fact that our most sovereign possession and most sovereign right should be choice. God chose to create us in his image, right? Okay, when he made that choice, he established himself as the creator of all that is good. And he created all that is good through the Word. In the beginning was the Word was with God, and the Word was God. And by God, all things were made that were made. Think about that in relationship to what's happening with us today and has been happening since 1945. It's done with the Word, right? But it's done with the spoken word spoken by man, and that would be the media. A lot of this has ridden on the back of media and science. Those are the two things. Those have been the perpetrators of the takeover of our world. It's based on conspiracy, based on persuasion by the word. And I call it the deconstruction of creation. The two people who really forwarded this thing were Margaret Sanger, and she was in 1935. It was written in the New York Times. She was the most prominent person on the face of the earth. People of our generations, and there are probably 3 generations at least represented here, maybe 4, people of those generations, we don't realize the impact that she and her cohorts had on the world. She was the most prominent person in the world in 1935, and you think about the timing of that too. They held this conference in 1927, and in 1935, she knew more people and was known by more people than anybody else in the world. She had tremendous persuasive ability because of her social connections. She knew the Emperor of Japan. She knew Mao Zedong. She was entertained by, who is the Buddhist philosopher? I don't remember his name. Do what? The Dalai Lama. She was entertained and had discourse with the Dalai Lama. She was known by every person of prominence on the face of the world. She had traveled to all the continents. By 1940, she had done all of those. By the time World War II started, and she had to stop traveling when World War II started, she spent 2 years in Berlin, post-1927 conference, establishing experimental laboratories that were manned by the same scientists that were working with Hitler's human experiment. She called human beings human material, and those who were less than the elite were considered human material. And you think about the philosophy of it's just a blob of tissue, let's abort it. All this came from this same movement and this same conspiracy in 1927. Margaret Sanger had many lovers. She did not believe in monogamy. I don't even go into detail when I speak about the very, very perverse lifestyle she lived. But her primary and favorite lover was a man by the name of Havelock Ellis. And I say he's the one who demonized her. He was a product of the Enlightenment. He was considerably older than Margaret. She was a very young woman when she started this. She was just in her 20s. And she met him in England when she went over there to study the concept of Malthusianism. And he was the author of a set of 7 encyclopedias called Sexology. And the last volume of that, in volume 7, it was called Sexual Inversion. And in this, he idealized a world where people could be either male or female or both genders, surgically through scientific advances, where people could have as many partners as they wanted, and we could reinvent ourselves as human beings and become sexually and materially whatever we wanted to be. It was our choice to do that. And he encouraged the scientists of this era, like the ones who were in attendance at the 1927 conference, he encouraged them to do experiments along those lines. Let's see what we can do to recreate a race where we are whole. What does God do for us? He makes us whole. And we're made whole with him. To be made whole in the way that Havelock Ellis and Margaret Sanger envisioned was being made as one and whole with the God of all corruption, and that would be Satan. It's quite obvious what happened. And of course, Margaret Sanger was close friends with Adolf Hitler. And both she and Hitler had all of their communication, all their propaganda structured by the same man, Joseph Goebbels. He was the propaganda theorist of the era. So everything at the 1927 conference that they had, she had met with he and Hitler in the Bavarian mountains before that conference. And by the way, all of this comes from Margaret Sanger's personal date books and personal journals. That's how we know this. That's why only we know this. Because in looking into, let me just do a little rewinding here so you'll understand how this research evolved. I was doing my doctoral dissertation, and it was on the communication that led the world to think it was okay to abort one's own child, period. That's the name of the name of the dissertation. And in the process of that, I discovered this journalist, a New York journalist, Harvard graduate, who taught journalism for Columbia University, for New York University for many years, 40 years. He taught nearly every major journalist of the 1950s and the 1960s. After he stepped into politics by being the writer and author of Roe v. Wade and the person who created NARAL, after he stepped into politics, he began to deploy through all of these journalists he had taught in American media primarily, but some in Europe and so forth. He deployed through them the stories that they needed to tell and the concepts they needed to present to the American people to get this evil word spoken into the culture. And so all of the mediated communication we have had since the 1950s has been corrupt for the most part. We've been told what they thought we needed to hear. So that's why we have been able to be persuaded through these decades that anything that we want, anything that we want to choose is okay. It was Havelock Ellis that originally perpetrated to Margaret Sanger that concept. And of course, she was a rabid Marxist. They all were rabid Marxists. And they were wanting to create a world in that image, and the image that was envisioned by Karl Marx. But they wanted to create a world that they could also take pleasure in, and where they would have pleasure buddies for everything and every kind of perversion that they chose to indulge in. So Havelock Ellis was Margaret Sanger's primary lover. He was married to a lesbian, and it was like a three-way, right? And then, I hate to get too graphic here, I get more graphic in the book. It's, we're thinking this will make a wonderful movie because Margaret Sanger's life is, it's worthy of the big screen, but the movie will have to be rated R because she was so evil in those ways. But another one of her lovers was H.G. Wells, The War of the Worlds, right? He was her number 2 favorite. He was also married to a lesbian. So this whole group would all get together, and there were many, many, many prominent people of the era and celebrities. Oh, let me tell you, more so than today, every celebrity just about was part of this group. They were very large and very powerful, and they selected the politicians that we've had. Franklin Roosevelt was friends with all these people. There was a state dinner held in 1944 with Margaret Sanger and a guy by the name of, and H.G. Wells was there, and there was a guy by the name of Hugh Moore. He was the founder of the Dixie Cup organization. All these people also were part of the industrial age. The financiers of this were people from the industrial age whose names you will recognize, the Fords, the Rockefellers, the Rothschilds, etc. But in the United States specifically, the Fords and the Rockefellers were the big proponents of this. The Kaisers, also from Germany, they were friends, Wilhelm Kaiser was personal friends with Margaret Sanger. And they financed this. His laboratories ran her human experiments simultaneously with Hitler's human experiments. This is so deep and so dark and so involved. You know, I already have one 325-page book, 20,000 research documents. We're getting ready to go and research this other guy I just talked about. His name is Hugh Moore, and he was an industrialist. He was very, very wealthy through his investments in industry. Margaret Sanger was his hero, and he was a close, close admirer of her, and he was also a Malthusian, and those are the people who believe in eugenics, you know, population control through eugenics and so forth, and the forming of a new world through it. He was at this state dinner with Margaret Sanger and Franklin Roosevelt and his wife Eleanor. Margaret Sanger was close personal friends with Eleanor Roosevelt. And at this, they proposed an organization that would take over for the League of Nations, an organization that should be focused on managing the world population, because therein lay our greatest danger, was world population. So Hugh Moore was the first officer of the United Nations. He helped found the United Nations. He's our next research subject. Because he was funded by the American government to found the United Nations. The Population Control Division of the United Nations was the very first branch of the UN. As a spinoff from that were 17 other global population control organizations, and they still exist. The United States alone, I think there are 17 still in existence, and they're very, very wealthy nonprofits. The Population Control Division of the United Nations still exists. Other things were added to it as time goes by, but you have to remember, that was 1945. The last revolution had taken place, you know? And we were getting, and then communism came in, right? It was the ultimatum of socialism, of Marxism. So by the early 1950s, we had been, the East, a lot of the East had been taken over by communism. So between communism and the liberalism holding the same ideologies, our culture has moved into an horrific era. And that era is that we have been taken over. We have been taken over, but not with guns and not with war machines. We have been taken over through people causing the public to believe that these things that have been done and are being done to us and that are being caused to be done to those who are the most vulnerable, that this is the way the world should be. And this is an artificially created world, not created in the image of God, of course. These same people are the ones that put through Roe v. Wade. Roe v. Wade was recently overturned using the information that I gave to the attorneys, personally, gave to the attorneys. And they used it, it is in the document of Roe v. Wade, that the only people who advised the court on Roe v. Wade were, guess who? Lawrence Lader, this journalist who also took over the media, his friend and cohort at New York University, a law professor, by the name of Cyril Means, Jr., and he was the legal counsel for NARAL, which was the National Association for the repeal of abortion law, and they are the ones that put through Roe v. Wade and authored the first document and structured the abortion law as we've known it as Roe v. Wade all these years. These two people advised the court, and they were the only two advisors that the court had, and one of them was a journalist, right? So that's how we've gotten where we are. Now what we're wanting to do is go look on the backside at the scientist, at this industrialist Hugh Moore, who was so empowering of the population control organizations that existed all over the world and still exist today. He gave Margaret Sanger's Planned Parenthood all of the funds from all of his much wealth to take an international Planned Parenthood federation all over the world. And now International Planned Parenthood has been doing abortions in all the countries in the world who take U.S. foreign aid since World War II, since President Franklin's bill went through. Yeah, since the United Nations was founded. Every single country, there are very few countries in the world where women get to choose whether or not to have an abortion. Most all of the countries in the world now, 97% of the countries in the world take U.S. foreign aid, and they are held to something like the one-child policy. And International Planned Parenthood clinics, the tens of thousands of them throughout the world, still work in lockstep with revolutionary governments to take over the population and the creation through abortion. So it's a deep and dark hole. And we're getting ready to go down the second tunnel in the deep, dark hole. And we're going to look into what has happened since 1945. And how we know how we got to where we got to by 1972. We know how Roe v. Wade got put through the court. We know how abortion became legalized. We know how people were persuaded to think that the things that we're doing and seeing and experiencing now as a world were okay to do, even in the sight of God. We know how that happened. Now we want to know how, who, what, and why they have taken over things like our public health system. And I don't go into that in my work much because I have a colleague by the name of Dr. Peter McCullough, who is also a Texan who does some excellent work in that area, and Robert Malone, Dr. Robert Malone. So I don't really get into the public health issues, but it's all part of the same thing. It is all part of the same thing. And at the end of the day, I believe the reason for this conspiracy is because Satan wants to take creation and mankind out of the hands of God and form the world in his vision for what he thinks it should be. And if you think of the way that the world is moving and the schemes and plots and plans and the true motive behind this conspiracy, you can quite clearly see that it is not anything that is of God, but conversely, it is from Satan himself. And we as God's people and God's creation who realize who and what we are, we have to fight back. And the way we fight back is not with guns. The way we fight back is the way we were created, with our words, with our wisdom given to us by God. I love the name of this conference, Wisdom Pearl, because we fight back with that wisdom. And how do we get wisdom? We research, and we write, and we talk. We talked about the Enlightenment, and the speakers that spoke after I did talked about the Enlightenment and Marxism and how we segued into the political, the terroristic political areas of Lenin and Stalin and so forth, all based in Marxism. And I left out the bridge that goes between the Enlightenment and that era, and that's what I would like to cover for you today. Okay, the Enlightenment took place in the 1700s and 1800s, and by the mid-1900s, it was segueing into, the thought processes of individuals. And of course, we have Isaac Newton, who authored the notion of biologically created creation without God in the mix, right? And so a lot of the philosophies, the philosophical thought, even the science of that era was based on that counter-narrative. And something I discovered in my research is that I can see a pattern here in when the thinking of our world and our culture shifted into an evil ideology. And it happened at the end of the Enlightenment era and going into the early 1900s. There was a very crucial time there when the thinking of the world shifted away from, even in America, like I said earlier, liberty and justice for all, the life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness that we're all entitled to as Americans in a constitutional republic that was based on God in the government. All of a sudden, we have let God out of the government, asked God to leave the government, and we have gone into this same ideology that was prevalent in the late 1800s and early 1900s after the Enlightenment. And this is my take on this. I believe that phase 2 of the Enlightenment era, this is when the instigators of the battle against God and created life began. They called it the Age of Reason. And what I believe is that they were the Satan-indoctrinated elites who had studied the works and thoughts and philosophies of the great minds, including the academy, which is the universities and so forth. And we even still look to the academy for our knowledge. And you heard several speakers talk about how they began to, study socialism and Marxism and so forth in their colleges and universities. And I have worked for Christian universities who also teach those things. It's a very, very precarious and difficult place we're in right now. And we have indoctrinated, even in the United States, all of our young people. And this has been happening since I was a kid in college, and that's been a long time. So it was, the academy is sort of a repository, I think. It's a breeding ground for the things that arise out of and have arisen out of Marxism and socialism. Okay. There was another enlightenment that took place at about the same time when these other things were ongoing. And I've read your book that you give away at your conferences, actually more than one time. I pulled some really good quotes out of that. But it's interesting to note that these quotes that I'm getting ready to read to you took place right after the Enlightenment period and right before Margaret Sanger and her folks took off in this trajectory. And it says this one is from, Ellen White lived from 1827 to 1915. Margaret Sanger and Havelock Ellis began their relationship and their wicked conspiracy in 1912. So this is all very much in the same time, and I think this was a precursor, a predictor, and even a prophecy, if you will, of what was getting ready to happen in this age between the Enlightenment and then the various political factions that rose up and took over the world. This is what she said. Man was the crowning act of the creation of God, made in the image of God and designed to be a counterpart of God. But Satan has labored to obliterate the image of God in man and to imprint upon him his own image. Man is very dear to God because he was formed in his own image. And then she also said in an article that she was interviewed for, that man was created to be the image and the glory of God. Adam and Eve had received endowments not unworthy of their high destiny. Graceful and symmetrical in form, regular and beautiful in feature, their countenance glowing with a tint of health and the light of joy and hope. They bore outward resemblance, in their outward resemblance, the likeness of their Maker. Now that is a beautiful definition of God-created humanity. Now then, we go directly from those thoughts from her mind and that prophetic utterance, I believe, into this. Havelock Ellis and Margaret Sanger got together in 1912, and they began to form this counter-ideology and this counter-narrative based on their rabid atheism and Marxism. Everything they did was either rooted in those two things or in the teachings of Thomas Malthus, who was also an atheist and a Marxist even a precursor to Marxism. So all of this is our counter-narrative that we're experiencing in today's culture is just part and parcel to when the enemy kicked off his great revenge against God and humanity. And then, of course, arising right after that became Lenin, and then Stalinism, and then Nazism, and his cooperation with Margaret Sanger, and it's very well documented in the book. All the things that they had to do, that they did together. And even the human experiments in transgenderism that took place here on Long Island at Cold Spring Harbor. That was all a product of these people working with these other operatives that were secular people. Havelock Ellis was a scientist and a medical doctor, and Margaret Sanger was a political activist and a nurse. And this is how we got where we are today. And so that bridge between the Enlightenment and the political movements that took place that switched our world in the opposite direction, those were prophesied by Ellen White. And the bridge to that became these two wicked operatives, Margaret Sanger and Havelock Ellis, and then the people they recruited into their movement. And we're seeing the results of that today. They laid the plan for everything we're seeing in our culture in their wicked meeting in 1927. And it was supposed to be fulfilled by 2027. And it's my personal belief that the reason we're seeing so much acceleration and let's get this wickedness perpetrated throughout our culture as quickly as we possibly can, they have a commitment to fulfilling that 100-year plan that they forged in 1927. You know, the one I told you about that is in the book that I have the only copy of that I know of in the world. I do have it digitized, and I have photocopies of everything. I didn't say that, and I forgot to this time when I talk. But everything I talk about and everything that is in this book that we've just published, and then in the next book, everything has a primary source document that proves what it says. So we have documentation to prove everything. And it's digitized, and I have several digital copies of everything. And at some point, if the arguments get too great, I'll just do a massive release on the internet of all the documents. And we'll prove that. So anyhow, I just wanted to say that because I feel it's crucial that as we go through this conference and we're unpacking all these things for you, that you know that this is a systematic plan, and that the person who was one of the organizers of the Seventh-day Adventist prophesied it clearly and directly right before it really got kicked off. So that's an exciting thing, and that's one of the reasons I think I fit so well with you guys, even though I'm a Catholic. So it's great to be with you, yeah. And that's why you see a Catholic priest sitting at my table and Catholic friends here. And we have a rabbi who will be back after Sabbath. He'll come back tomorrow. He was here today, and he'll be back again tomorrow. So, you know, we are God's people, and we must unite, and we have to coalesce around the truth. You will know the truth, and the truth will set you free. And we have to have as much proven, credible, reliable, and passionate truth that we can, or we won't survive. But, you know, what an exciting thing to live in the days that Daniel prophesied. You know, the apostles envied those of us who would live in this hour. It's an exciting place to be. We're here to prepare the way for the coming of the King. What greater role to play in history. I'm glad to be alive now. I'm glad to be called to do this work. And everyone in this room is called to be a truth seeker and a truth teller. And we are the people that God will use in this age to prepare the way for the soon coming of the Messiah. And by the way, Rabbi Gotti says, when Jesus comes again, yes, he will bow down and worship him. Right? So it's wonderful to be with you. I love this conference. This is my favorite place I speak because it's wonderful to be with like-minded God's people. And so thank you so much for having me. Talk to you later. Stop and talk to me, okay? Yeah.